Thing first.
Yes. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Facebook Live on managing anxiety. We have Dr. Himle today that's going to talk a little bit about how we can particularly manage our anxiety during the holidays and during this unusual year. So thank you, Dr. Himle, so much for joining. And now you can begin with your presentation.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Give me just a second while I share my screen. I am excited to be here talking with you guys, with you all today, especially this time of year when everyone is dealing with the excitement and the stress and the anxiety that comes with the holidays, and especially this year with the added uncertainty and anxieties and changes that we've all had to make in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Mike Himle. I am a clinical psychologist and an associate professor and the director of our PhD clinical training program in psychology at the University of Utah. This is a topic that is kind of near and dear to my heart. I've been working in Tourette for many years now, both in terms of managing the tics, but especially more recently focusing more on managing the anxiety and the comorbidity that often comes along with the tics and the Tourette diagnosis. So in putting my slides together today, I was talking with Natalie and she asked that I keep my presentation relatively short, which is hard to do with the topic that is this important and this complicated. And so I went to my 13-year-old daughter and I asked her how to sum up what we'd be talking about today. And it basically comes down to 2 slides. I have more than that, but these are the 2 slides that sum up what we're going to be talking about today. That, you know, this is really the expectation for the holidays, right? We're getting all the cards in the mail. We're seeing the decorations on the streets. People are starting to wish us happy holidays and peace and joy, as if the holidays were a time of nothing but positivity. The reality is the holidays look a little bit more like this, right? For many of us. And so there's a lot of stress that comes with the holidays. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety, and that can be especially difficult to manage for people who are struggling with anxiety as a comorbidity and with tics as well. Now, the truth is, I don't want to give the holidays a bad rap. The holidays are good. There have been surveys and most people report that during the holidays, they experience an increase in a sense of happiness and love and high spirits and connectedness. Though this year that connectedness is going to look very different for many of us when we're unable to see our family and get together. And in fact, the surveys that have been done show that people love the holidays and really look forward to spending time with loved ones. And so, you know, we have to accept the reality that the holidays this year might look a little bit different. A lot of people do also experience negative emotions during the holidays. So the vast majority of people, if you ask them, report experiencing fatigue and stress, irritability, sadness, anger, and loneliness, and especially again this year. So the holidays are a time of stress, also a time of happiness. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that if you're experiencing some of the negative emotions, you're not alone. Most people are. And that it also can be both difficult and confusing when you are experiencing multiple emotions at the same time. So it's perfectly understandable when people experience both irritability and happiness, or even sadness and happiness all at the same time. And that can actually be a stressful experience. In looking at what makes the holidays so stressful, there are a lot of factors: lack of time, lack of money, the commercialism and the hype that goes around the holidays are stressful for some, the pressure of getting and giving gifts, family gatherings, diet, right? We're bombarded with sweets and treats through the holiday season, and that can actually contribute to stress. And in fact, overindulgence in some of those things, as I'm going to talk about in a little bit, can actually decrease our ability to manage that stress. It's also a time where a lot of people feel pressured or want to gift a lot of things to a lot of people, and this can lead to credit card debt, financial problems. Again, especially this year, this might be confounded by the fact that many people are struggling financially due to the COVID pandemic, and so they're struggling with wanting to be able to have a normal holiday season where they're giving gifts with the financial realities that running up credit card debt could be problematic. This survey obviously was done by the American Psychological Association and didn't include it. So I went ahead and threw Tourette on there. Tourette can also be a holiday stressor. We know that tics are exacerbated by stress and can be a cause of stress. And so this is a time of year where people with tics are often struggling to manage on a day-to-day basis. And of course, we know that the tics are just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of people with Tourette are dealing with the underlying comorbidity, things like anxiety and depression, as well as many of the other things parents are dealing with kids who have behavioral issues and impulsivity and ADHD, and these can all be added stressors during the holidays. On top of the stressors that are the holiday, I want to just really highlight why this year feels so much more stressful to many people than the normal year. I realize that this slide might be a little bit hard to see, and so I'm picturing some of you moving up close to your screen. So I'm just going to walk you through a few important points from this slide. So what this is actually a measure that some psychologists put together quite some time ago that lists some of the major stressors that people experience throughout their life. And so at any given time, somebody might be experiencing any one of these items as a stressor. And through a lot of research, what they did is they came up with the 50 biggest stressors, and they were able to put a value on them. And what the value shows is basically relative to others, how stressful are these life events. And the take-home point here is that stressful life events, so life stressors add up. So it's not just about one stressor or two stressors. If you are experiencing more stressors, there's an additive effect. They add up to create more stress. And if you reach a certain point, those stressors add up and they start to negatively impact your health. And so the cutoff for this scale when it's used in research is you want to keep your score under about 150. And that's really difficult for a lot of us to do. And so if you look at what contributes to stress in people's everyday lives, I mean, we can start with the fact that major holidays are one of the top 50 stressors that people experience, and they experience this every year, regardless of what's going on, regardless of COVID, regardless of Tourette, regardless of what else is going on in their life. The holidays are a stressor for the vast majority of people, and a significant stressor. Then we look at the added stressors, the other stressors that COVID adds, and we see things like a major personal injury or illness, which I think COVID would certainly fall into, is one of the top 6 stressors that people can experience. We can then add on major change in financial status, which a lot of people are experiencing in response to COVID, major change in responsibilities at work, which a lot of people are experiencing in response to COVID, major change in living conditions, working from home, homeschooling. All of these things are among the top stressors that people can experience. Revision of personal habits. Again, just the social distancing, the things that we've had to do in response to COVID can be a major stressor. Major changes in working hours, major changes in the usual type or amount of recreation, major changes in social activities, major changes in the number of family get-togethers. All of these things have been negatively impacted by COVID, and all of these things are some of the biggest stressors that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Then we also have to keep in mind that in the current circumstances, COVID related or not, there are a lot of people who are dealing with major life stressors like the loss of a loved one, and this is their first holiday without grandparents, without a spouse, etc. So the take-home point here is that especially this year, in light of the holidays and the COVID situation, it's understandable if you're experiencing a lot of stress. And the problem that we face with all of this stress is that a little bit of stress is okay. Stress is actually helpful. Stress is what motivates us to do well at work. Stress is what motivates us to perform better. If we have no stress in our lives, we're actually more likely to report feeling bored or unsatisfied. But at some point, those stressors add up, and that's where we stop performing at our peak. Once the stressors overwhelm us, we start to get to the point where we experience fatigue and exhaustion. This is the point where anxiety worsens, or maybe we're experiencing anxiety for the first time. It can lead to anger, it can lead to panic attacks, and it can even lead to burnout and breakdown, things like apathy. that you just don't care anymore, don't feel like you have the energy to make change or to change things. So before we get into the meat of today is to talk a little bit about how we can handle all of these stressors that are to be expected during the holidays and especially in light of COVID. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about how we understand stress and anxiety, because this is really going to set the tone for the rest of the talk. Most people think of stress as a collection of life events, something that happens to them. And this is to some extent true. We see this in how we talk about stress on a day-to-day basis. We say things like, oh, that thing is really stressing me out, or you are really stressing me out. And we talk about the event as being the stress. And in fact, that event is the stressor. It's the precipitant. It's the thing that leads to or causes the stress. But stress is much more complicated than that. Stress is actually an experience that occurs when a person perceives that the demands that have been placed on them exceed the personal and social resources that they are able to mobilize. And the key here is that it comes down to a person's perception, as well as the availability of their personal and social resources. And especially now, where we're not able to socialize in the same way that we have in the past, these resources can sometimes feel quite thin. And we're going to talk about what to do with that in just a little bit. So in some ways, we have to think about stress as not what happens to us, but how we respond to the things that happen to us. So how we react to those stressors that occur in our everyday environment. And key to this is the perception of control. So I use this example. I guess it doesn't hit home quite as well anymore since I haven't been on an airplane in almost a year. But most of us get really stressed out by flying. If you get on an airplane and it's really crowded and it takes off, being around the people, being crammed into that tube that's flying through the air is quite stressful for most people. And in fact, there are studies showing that the stress response increases while you're flying. And yet, those same people who find flying very, very stressful, and not because they're scared of heights or not because they're scared of flying, but just because they're packed into a can like a sardine, those same people are willing to go out and go to a concert where there are tens of thousands of other people crammed into a single venue. And why is that? Why would one situation be so stressful and the other one would be something that we actually see as fun and that we would seek out as a form of recreation? And the answer is, it all comes down to our perception of control. Control is determined both by our sense of something being a choice and by our sense of being able to change it. So once you're on that airplane and you take off, there's no getting off the airplane until it lands. If you're at the concert and you decide to leave, you can leave at any time that you want. So there's the option to change the situation. So the key here is that our perception is really important when we think about how things stress us out. And fortunately, our perception is something that we can control. So stress isn't just in your head. Stress is environmental. Stressors affect different people differently. The occupation you have could be stressful. The neighborhood you live in could be stressful. Some people experience more stressful life events than others. Stress is also physical. It affects our nervous system. It creates autonomic activity in our nervous system. It impacts our immune system. It actually decreases our body's ability to fight off infections. And it actually affects our endocrine system, our hormonal system, which is essential in regulating all kinds of different body activities, from digestion to growth to a number of other things. Stress is also emotional. It can lead to anxiety and depression. People who experience more stressors report a decreased sense of well-being. Stress also has a cognitive effect. It impairs memory. So when you're really stressed out, you might notice that you have a harder time remembering things. You might make a grocery list of 2 or 3 things, get to the grocery store and have a hard time remembering the 1 or 2 things on your list. It can also impair learning. It can impair and decrease attention. And it also can lead to what I call stress goggles. It makes us appraise or think about what's happening to us in a negative light. So when we're particularly stressed out, we have a tendency to see things in a more stressful way. When we are anxious, we tend to see things in a more threatening way. When we are depressed, we tend to see things in a more depressed or negative way. So stress can have this direct effect, and it can actually lead us to attend to things that are negative and ignore the things that are positive that are happening in our lives. Stress is also behavioral. Some people are more able to approach stressful situations than others, and some people have a tendency to avoid when they get stressed. And this is a really important thing to recognize about yourself, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And then stress is also social. So we know that loneliness and isolation, for example, are as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So our motivation and drive, we need to be around other people. We need to connect with other people. And isolating and avoiding people can really have a negative impact on our overall well-being and health. And it turns out that socializing and sharing and interacting with others can buffer against stress and be a major source of coping. I'm almost done with my lecture slides, I promise. But it is important to understand the stress response. And I like to think about the stress response in terms of, it serves a purpose, right? So stress isn't all bad. It motivates us. So short-term stress is essential for our survival. And most of our stressors are short-term and physical. So we would expect to have a strong physical reaction if we were walking across a busy street and there were cars buzzing by us. That is going to be a very stressful situation. We're going to be motivated to get out of that situation. If you're walking down a dark alley and you see something in the shadows or you hear a noise, you're going to have a strong stress reaction. It's designed to keep us safe. It's designed to keep us alive. The problem is that same stress response is activated in this modern world by things that aren't really essential to our survival. Whether or not we we burn the turkey at Thanksgiving is not essential to our survival, and yet it's something that we worry about. Did that turkey thaw correctly? Did we season it right? Did we cook it at the right time? Is it going to be edible? Those can be stressful. They can actually create the same physiological response as something that's actually dangerous and threatening our survival. So unfortunately, we are basically creatures that are designed to respond as if we're being chased by a wild animal. But the reality is that most of our stressors are not physical, they're psychological, and they are social. So the connection between stress and anxiety is also important. Stress can lead to anxiety, but anxiety is a little bit different. Anxiety involves persistent and excessive worries that don't go away, even in the absence of a stressor. So a lot of times we think about, there's a lot of shared overlap. There are physical symptoms to anxiety and stress that are very similar, and there are cognitive symptoms that are very similar. But it's important when we think about this from the standpoint of Tourette, is that stress and anxiety can both make tics worse, and tics can be a major source of stress and anxiety. So that's something that I want to come back to and talk about a little bit as we go through the rest of the presentation. So in thinking about how to wrap this up and how I can make this useful, rather than just giving a lecture that I think is interesting, but maybe you do and maybe you don't, I wanted to give you a couple of take-home points. And we know from research that you're better off if you give 3 to 5 take-home points. So what are the top 3 to 5 things that you want people to take away from your presentation? So I decided to come down, boil this down to 5 steps for managing stress and anxiety during the holidays. So these are 5 things that if you take to heart and really make an effort to implement, I am confident can lead to a happier, healthier, and more joyful holiday season. So here we go. Number 1. The first one is to be prepared. You have time to prepare for the upcoming holidays, and you can prepare by understanding your stressors and your stress style. So the first way to do this, the action plan in doing this, is to write down your stressors. Write down the things that are stressing you out, and then get familiar with your stress response. Understand that stress is physical, it's cognitive, it's emotional, and it's behavioral. So understand your personality. How do you tend to respond to stress? Do you tend to get really irritable? Do you tend to experience your stress physically with a lot of muscle aches and headaches and backaches? Do you tend to respond to stress with a lot of worry and indecision and negativity? So really thinking about your own stress profile is the number 1 key in being able to manage your stress as you go throughout the holidays. And how I recommend you do this is that you find yourself a notebook, and on one page you write down your stressors, or the stressors that you anticipate are going to happen through the holidays, and write down your stress response. Writing it down is really important, because as you get more stressed, as the holidays start to roll around and you experience more stress, um, it becomes more and more difficult to keep in mind complicated things like, what are the physical parts of my stress, the emotional parts of my stress, the cognitive parts of my stress. Having it written down allows you to go back and review it, and you've already done the work. You've already gotten this information out of your brain and down onto paper so that you can reference it later on. So that's step number one. Step number two, take control where you can. Ultimately, stress comes down to your perception of control. And of course, some things can't be controlled. We cannot control, whether or not we were recently fired. What we can control is whether or not we decide to seek out a new job. We can't control whether or not we are on lockdown because of COVID. But what we can control a lot of things about that. We can control what we decide to do with our time during lockdown. We can decide to take control over our day-to-day activities and find the silver linings, which we'll talk about in a bit. So take control where you can. And one of the steps in this is eliminating everyday hassles and minor annoyances that can add up really, really quickly. And we can all make a list of these, right? I really need to go to the store and pick up some item. Ask, do you really need to do that, right? I really need to do this. I need to do that. And so what you really need to do is evaluate whether or not this is a want or a need. If it's a want, it's something that maybe you can forego. And if it's a need, then it's something you need to follow through with. So make a plan and stick to it. Make a schedule, make a list of things that are absolute needs, make a list of things that are wants or things that you would like to be able to get done, but you'll be okay if you don't. And start with the things that are most important and eliminate the things that are more hassles. And when I talk about this idea of control, a lot of this, one way to recognize this is oftentimes the wants or the things that can be eliminated, the daily hassles, come down to things that we tell ourselves we should do, things like have to, musts, and shoulds, right? So we tell ourselves, well, I have to do this, or I must do this, or I should do this. And the question is, says who, right? Who says that you have to do that? Maybe there's a different way. Or maybe there are things that you don't necessarily have to do, but you've been telling yourself that you have to do. So let me give you an example of this. Actually, one of the questions that was submitted for this talk is that during this time of year, I feel pressure to keep everyone happy. My kids, my spouse, my sister's family, my brother, my parents, my in-laws. It takes away from the magic of the holidays because I feel like I'm letting somebody down. Do you have any advice? And my advice is, if you look at this, my guess is there's a whole lot of shoulding going on. I should do this. I should do that. I have to do this. I have to do that. And maybe my advice would be to stop, shoulding yourself. And what it comes down to is when you say I should, this basically just means creating a ton of pressure on yourself to do or be something based on what you think you're supposed to be, right? By somebody else's standards, rather than who you are and what you want. So maybe this holiday season, with everything that's going on, with COVID, with the lockdowns that are happening across the country, maybe it's time to focus a little bit more on being who you are and doing what you want rather than what you think you should do, or maybe just what you have done in the past. All right, step number 3, buffer, recover, and restore. And you guys are all going to remember this because you're going to picture this cute little snowman that I put up here who's shivering going brr. So buffer, recover, and restore. So every time you see a snowman this holiday season, I want you to go brr and think about buffer, recover, and restore. And what do I mean by this? I mean that it is essential that we take care of ourselves during stressful times. And I know this can sound cliche, but this all comes down to sleep, exercise, diet, self-time, and socialization. Take diet, for example. This is a season where you are going to be bombarded with sweets and fats and things that are not particularly healthy. And it is okay to eat some of that. It is okay to indulge in some of that, but it needs to be balanced with a healthy diet. It turns out that when we are stressed out, our bodies release stress hormones. Those stress hormones actually drive cravings for things like sugar and fat, because those are fuels our body burns very quickly to be able to run away from wild animals. But unfortunately, those also lead to fatigue. They also lead to other symptoms, unwanted symptoms of stress, and make it harder for our body to actually recover when we do face stress. Sleep is absolutely essential. Sleep is how our body erases the stress of the day. All of those hassles, all of those stressors that built up throughout the day are erased to some extent or alleviated to some extent through sleep. If you shortchange yourself on sleep, you're basically starting the next day at a higher level of stress than you would have had you gotten a good night's sleep. Exercise is very similar, and if you can get out and move around in nature, turns out research shows that that's even better. But this doesn't mean that you have to go out and run a 5K, but getting out and moving, getting outside, moving your body, getting some exercise can buffer you against stress, improve mood. It's really important to find time to do this. Socialization, that's going to be difficult during this holiday season, but it also is essential. We know that when we interact with others, that this releases all kinds of physiological responses that improve our mood and buffer us against stress and help to decrease the overall stress response. In order to do these things, the key is to find time for yourself. Find time to engage in pleasurable activities, find time to get a good night's sleep, find the time to exercise, and committing to doing these things. So it's easy for me to say these things, and you're going to think of these things every time you see a snowman because you're going to go burr, buffer, recover, and restore. But the key is that you have to make some goals for this holiday season, and you have to schedule these into your everyday activities. If you want to stick to this, the time to start is now. Find the time to do it. Figure out when you're going to do it, and really, really prioritize these things and make a concerted effort to do it. And I think you'll really be surprised at how much better you feel if you can follow through with taking care of yourself. Number 4, it is the season for sharing. It turns out that research shows that sharing your feelings reduces stress. The problem is we tend to internalize our stress. Most of us tend to keep our stress inside. We keep it to ourselves. We don't want to talk about it. And the key is being able to just verbalize it. It turns out the research shows that just saying things like, I am stressed because, and then finishing that sentence decreases the overall level of stress that you're feeling. If you can't find somebody to say it to, just say it out loud to yourself. Ideally, though, sharing this information with others, talking with somebody, it's not about creating a solution to the stressor. It's not about finding a way to eliminate the stressor, right? If you are having financial problems, you're not going to fix those by simply sitting down and talking with a friend or a family member and saying, I'm really stressed out over my finances. But it turns out talking about it is going to make you feel better, and feeling better is going to make you better able to manage that stressor and come up with steps that you can take towards moving in a direction that's less stressful. So let go of your stress by sharing it out. And then finally, and I would say probably most importantly, aside from the buffer and restore, is being mindful of your perspective. So reframing is key. Reframing is viewing something in a different way or processing a situation from a new perspective. This is not blind optimism. This is not simply convincing yourself that everything is fine. The truth is everything isn't fine. COVID sucks. COVID is not fun. Nobody wants to deal with it. Everybody is anxious. Everybody's stress is high. The effects of COVID, not fun. If you are experiencing financial stress, COVID related or not, nobody is saying that it is, just be optimistic about it. View it as not a problem. There are problems out there. The key is to reframe the problem into something that is stressful and outside your control to something that potentially has positives that you can control. So let me give you a few examples. Here's some cognitive reframing related to self-isolation. And this is something that's been circulating around the web that I kind of like. So one way to look at self-isolation during COVID is to say, my friends and I can't see each other. No doubt that's stressful. No doubt that is unpleasant. But another way to look at that is my friends and I are protecting each other. We're taking care of each other so that we can get together sooner. I'm stuck at home, I'm safe at home. I've lost all of my freedom, or I am making a choice to self-isolate because it's what's best for myself and others. I miss the things I love versus I'm increasing my gratitude for the things I love, right? I'm recognizing COVID has given me a chance to reflect and recognize that there are things that I enjoy doing, and I actually miss more than I recognized before COVID came around. So this form of cognitive reframing really can take a stressor and turn it into something less stressful. Another way to do this is through something called mindfulness. Mindfulness involves setting aside some time to really just sit and notice, being in the here and now. Notice what's going on with your body. Notice what's going on with your thoughts. It's a little more difficult than that, and it's beyond the scope of a 20-minute talk. But there are some really great apps out there that you can get that teach mindfulness. And it turns out that research has shown that even 10 to 15 minutes of mindfulness each day can decrease overall stress and increase well-being. So I really would encourage you to do that. One way to think about this idea of reframing when it comes time for the holidays, it reminds me of a news article I saw the other day, and you can look it up on CNN. It was a graduate student out of Stanford who went and lived in northern Norway, in Tromsø, Norway for a while, to look at something called seasonal affective disorder. And what she realized is that the perspective that people in northern Norway have about winter is very different than the perspective that a lot of Westerners have about winter. That when winter rolls around, there's no doubt it's cold. There's no doubt it's dark. I mean, it's dark for 2 to 3 months at a time. But what she noticed is that the reframe that people do up there is they view it as an opportunity. They view it as an opportunity to bundle up. They view it as an opportunity to be cozy, which feels good. They view it as an opportunity to do more reading. They view it as an opportunity to have more fires and sit by the fire. So they find the silver linings in the winter and thus are better able to cope. And what we actually find is that there are decreased rates of depression, decreased rates of seasonal affective depression in some of these parts of the country where people have learned to manage these things that most of us would say, winter sucks, it's cold, you have to shovel your driveway, it's dark. There's more than one way to look at it. So reframing takes practice, but if you can learn to do it, really can turn things around. So just to recap, number one, understand your stressors and your stress style. Again, write these things down. I really would encourage you to be active in doing this. This isn't something that you just think about while you're multitasking and doing your work. This is something that you should take time to sit down and really think about. Control what you can. Buffer, recover, and restore. So again, you're going to think about that every time you see a snowman this winter. 'Tis the season for sharing. Share it out. Talk about your stressors. Talk about your anxiety with a friend, with a family member, with somebody who's going to be supportive. If you don't have somebody like that in your life, use this holiday season as a time to find a therapist, find a professional to talk to, just find somebody, and then change your perspective. Try reframing. Try thinking about things differently. Instead of viewing that stress-induced tic exacerbation as something to avoid, view it as an opportunity to explore what it is that's causing that tic exacerbation. So change your perspective on things and to reduce stress. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions. I did have a few come in before this, but I think things are open, if I'm right, Natalie, for people to share on the chat as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. I don't see any. Oh, how can I be more? So I got the first one that came in. How can I be more calm on a day-to-day basis? A couple of things. I think, first and foremost, again, it comes down to recognizing your stress and anxiety. So stress and anxiety tend to build throughout the day. If you experience stress headaches or muscle aches at the end of the day, that that is caused by the fact that your stress builds up throughout the day and muscle tension increases throughout the day. And if you can be more mindful periodically throughout the day of how you're feeling, what's stressing you out, you can recognize earlier on that you perhaps are stressed, that you're tense. There are good relaxation strategies out there. So I would encourage you, Google diaphragmatic breathing. There actually is a right way to do relaxed breathing and a wrong way. So Google that, as well as progressive muscle relaxation. And again, there are some really good apps out there that will walk you through some of these calming exercises that decrease the overall physiological arousal. Part of the reason that that works is because when you become physiologically aroused, even if you're not dealing with an immediate stressor, your brain goes looking for a reason. It goes looking for a reason that your heart rate is up. It goes looking for a reason that your muscles are tense. And so when your brain goes looking for a reason, it's going to find one. It's going to find lots of them. It's going to say, maybe I'm worried about my, my children. Maybe I'm worried about my job. Maybe I'm worried about my finances. Maybe I'm worried about, so pretty soon you're just thinking about all of the stressful stuff. So if you can learn to physiologically relax through diaphragmatic breathing, through mindfulness, through progressive muscle relaxation, those can be really helpful. Explain the terms buffer, recover, and restore some more. Yeah, so it turns out that basically what that comes down to is the fact that we're gonna encounter stressors. Everybody is going to encounter stressors, ongoing stressors throughout their life. And as I mentioned, stress is actually beneficial in small doses. It motivates us to do well. It motivates us to perform. The key is that if we acknowledge that we are going to come into contact with stressors, we can prepare for them. And so buffering involves just making sure that our bodies are prepared to encounter stress, again, by getting sufficient sleep, by being healthy, by having a good appetite. Recover is, once we come into contact with those stressors, being able to decrease our overall stress level. So think of it a little bit like this. Sleep decreases our overall stress level. Exercise decreases our stress level. A healthy appetite decreases our stress level. All of those things make us better able to take on more stress. And so if we think about our stress as building up throughout the day, so maybe we start the morning and our stress level is at a 5, and by the end of the day, it's at a 60. And a 60 is pretty high. We're pretty stressed out at the end of the day. And now we short ourselves on sleep, we don't get enough exercise, and we don't eat well. The next morning we wake up and we're starting from a 30. And then we have another day where our stress builds up and we end that day at a 70. And then we short ourselves on sleep again to try to catch up on work or to whatever it might be. We lay awake worrying. So the next morning we wake up and we're at a 40. So pretty soon the stress builds up to where our body is not prepared to take on any more stress and it starts to shut down. So the idea behind buffer, recover, and restore means doing the things that we need to do to both prepare our body to take on more stress and to decrease the stress that we have taken on throughout the day. And we do that through diet, we do that through exercise, we do that through sleep, we do that through socializing, and we do that through some of the other techniques like learning to reframe and problem solve some of the stressors in our lives. How do I best prepare family members for tics from a child at family gatherings? That is a great question. So, I think the key is just being ready to, and I'm not sure if you mean prepare family members for tics as in expecting that the tics are going to worsen, or if you're going to encounter family members that don't know about the tics, or sometimes I've run into families where there are family members who are less accepting of the tics, things like that. If you want to elaborate on that question a little bit more, maybe I can give you a better answer. I did get another one that came in that said, my excitement makes my son's tics more intense. How do I help him without squashing his joy? And I think it is essential that we don't squash joy. So here's the scoop on tics and excitement and stress. We know that stress exacerbates tics. Not all stressors are what we would call negatively valenced. So some stressors are actually things that we view as positives. Turns out getting married is a huge stressor. The holidays, which are generally considered positive, huge stressor. Starting a new school year, huge stressor. A big baseball game or sporting event, huge stressor. Things that we anticipate that we look forward to cause our body to have a stress response. So stressors can actually be things that we would describe as exciting or things that we anticipate. The key is that when we talk about how stress exacerbates tics, how I talk about it is that if the tic exacerbation is causing a problem, then we want to try to minimize it. If it's not, then I say let it go. So for example, there's a big difference between a kid who gets excited and his facial tics flare up a little bit, but it's not really interfering with anything. In that case, I say the excitement is worth the flare up. Enjoy your holidays. If the flare up is causing headaches, it's causing a neck snapping tic or a whiplash tic that is really painful and fatiguing, then I say the key is to allow the excitement, but also to practice emotion regulation strategies. So practice relaxation. Maybe it's a matter of doing 10 or 15 minutes of relaxation in the morning and then doing another 10 or 15 minutes of relaxation at night so that you can get to sleep and get a good night's sleep. And so it kind of comes down to whether or not the tic exacerbation is problematic. Okay, so some clarification on how do I best prepare family members for tics from a child at family gatherings. Both family members who are not accepting or think tics are behaviors that should be corrected, or family members who try to quiet or reprimand a ticking child. Here I say that you kind of have to be the velvet bulldozer. It really is important for the family members to understand that these tics are involuntary, that they are not intentional. But despite the fact that they're involuntary and non-intentional, they are impacted by reactions. So there is actually some research showing that when you tell a child to stop ticking, you run the risk of accidentally making the tics worse, what we call reinforcing the tics. So I think what I would do is upfront, I would talk with the family members and I would say, here are our expectations, here's our rationale, and get them on board ahead of time with creating what we call a tic neutral environment. The tics should not receive any particular attention. They should not receive any particular accommodation. The expectation should be the same for a child who's ticking versus a child who's not, unless there's a reason that accommodation needs to take place, especially in really severe cases. So I err on the side of education. There's a lot of good educational materials that the TREAD Association has that you can request for free, and you could even send those ahead of time that explain some of these things, that sometimes when kids suppress their tics or their tics get worse in some situations versus others, it can make it look like they're intentional, but they're not. But I have found that just educating family members on those topics ahead of time can help to stave off a lot of the problems that we see. But trying to quiet or reprimand a child for ticking it's not going to decrease the tics. It's not going to have its intended effect. And I think that it's important that family members understand that not only is that not going to work, it could actually backfire and make things worse. So Kathy from Facebook asked, my stressor is illness. I have previously seen a therapist for PTSD from the flu. How do I calm myself during COVID? Yeah, this is a really tough one. COVID is difficult for a lot of people who have PTSD and a lot of people who have OCD, a lot of people who have health anxiety. I think the key is to just maintain a balanced perspective. that overdoing the protective elements of avoiding COVID can actually lead to additional stress. But certainly following recommendations, can be helpful. And so, maintaining 6 feet of social distancing, following the local directives related to best practices for not allowing COVID, but then also realizing that you have to live your life. So I think really, again, reframing this as a time where you can, perhaps think about COVID differently, so that you can get out there and continue to live your life. This is a great question. How do you explain swearing tics to a 90-year-old grandma? It can be hard. It can be difficult. Here's how I explain it. I explain it to a lot of family members as, it can be easy to think that swearing tics are intentional. And it can be easy to assume that they must mean what they say. And the reality is, how Tourette works is that the brain, when we go into any situation, the brain monitors what's going on around us, and it determines what behaviors are appropriate for that situation and what behaviors aren't. And the brain does this automatically. And so the brain releases the behaviors that are appropriate for the situation, and it suppresses the ones that aren't, right? And the problem with Tourette is that that break, or that suppressing, doesn't quite work. So some of those other behaviors slip through. So when we walk into any given situation, we look around and we tell ourselves, here are the things that would be appropriate and here are the things that aren't. So if I walk into a really fancy restaurant, I know there are things that I shouldn't do. I know that there are things that I should do. The problem with kids with Tourette, and especially kids with coprolalia, is that when they walk into a situation, maybe it's around 90-year-old grandma, they know that swearing is not appropriate around 90-year-old grandma, but simply thinking about not swearing increases the likelihood that they're going to swear. So maybe what I would do is do the white bear phenomenon exercise with grandma. And if you're not familiar with this, it goes something like this. What I want you to do is I want you to close your eyes and just humor me. And I want you, for the next 30 seconds, to do whatever you can. Imagine that your life depends upon it, right? I want you to do anything that you possibly can do to not think about a white bear. I don't want you to picture a white bear. I don't want you to picture a polar bear. Certainly don't want you to picture the white fuzzy fur. Don't picture it walking across an iceberg. Just do not picture a white bear. And then you ask grandma, when I asked you to do that, did you think about a white bear? And the truthful answer is yes, I thought about a white bear. And if she says no, then you say, well, how do you know you didn't think about a white bear? Because the only way you could not think about a white bear and know that is if you thought about a white bear. So the white bear phenomenon is a really good example of what happens in coprolalia. When a kid walks into that situation, all they want to do is not swear. All they want to do is not swear around grandma, but because they want to not swear so bad, they end up swearing, right? So it's the white bear phenomenon at its best. So maybe it will make grandma feel better to know that the more they swear around her, the more they don't want to swear around her, the more they respect her, the more they understand that she would disapprove of that language. So it actually is a reframe. It turns it in from something that is disrespectful to something that actually shows that they are being more respectful than you might realize. Let's see, a couple more. A couple that are less related to stress and anxiety, but I'll answer them anyway. Do tics subside or decrease with age and maturity? If you're on today, the person that asked that question, yeah, it turns out for most people, tics tend to wax and wane and get a little bit worse through adolescence. And then for the vast majority of people, they improve into young adulthood. There are about a third of people whose tics maintain into adulthood and continue to be problematic, but for about 2/3 of people, they improve at least to some extent. There are a couple of questions about, I do want to address Ruby ask, and I can't get a diagnosis yet, but I feel like a poser without one. Am I still valid? Ruby, to some extent, you're the norm. We know that the vast majority of people who have tics and Tourette out there actually aren't diagnosed. Most recent estimates are that about half of people with tics and Tourette go undiagnosed. So you are valid. You are not a poser. And I hope that makes you feel just a little bit better. If you have tics, I would encourage you though to go talk with your healthcare provider. The diagnosis of a tic disorder and Tourette is not a real complicated one, but it is important that especially if they're causing any sort of problem, that you go in and learn more about it, get the diagnosis, and understand what options are available to you. A question, let me scroll down. Question about, there's a couple questions actually. And the questions basically revolve around, it's already difficult a lot of times for individuals with tics, especially really visible tics in moderate to severe cases, to get jobs. COVID has made getting jobs more difficult, made it more competitive. There are fewer jobs out there, and what to do about that. This is a tricky question. It's difficult. Certainly, not having a job can be a source of significant stress, which can actually make Tourette and the associated comorbidities worse, can decrease motivation to go out and try to seek a job. I'll say this, and I hope this is helpful. We know that engaging in what we call tasks of mastery can overall decrease both the severity and frequency of tics, as well as resilience in the face of tics. And so, the key here is to be resilient, to really sit down and figure out what sort of job you are qualified for, what sort of job you want, and maybe think of COVID. So you want to do a reframe here. Maybe think of COVID as a time where you can spend some time really buttoning up that resume. Spend some time talking with friends and family, and maybe even an occupational advisor on what job qualifications you have and what sort of jobs you might be perfect for. Think about whether there's additional training or respecialization you can do, and use COVID as a time to do that. A lot of programs are offering such trainings online right now. So really think about how you can maybe capitalize on the fact that you don't have a job, which means you have more time, and see if you can't turn that into an opportunity to further increase your job prospects once things start to come around. And then even if you can't wait, financially you need the money, then finding a job that suits you, you got to reframe that a little bit too. Think about what are the advantages of having a job right now, and focus on that. Focus on why you need a job, not focus less on finding the perfect job, right? So I think the key is to focus on the here and now, be present in the here and now, and try to take advantage of the fact that that even though there are fewer jobs available, that there are opportunities out there, and capitalize on those. As somebody posted in the chat, the job accommodation network might be helpful for job seekers as well. So that's a really great suggestion. What else do we have? There were a couple of questions actually about sensory sensitivities, and one question in particular about something called misophonia, which is when you have an emotional reaction to sensory stimuli. Usually we think of it in terms of sound. I will say that a lot of kids with Tourette have sensory sensitivities, and so those actually can be exacerbated by stress and anxiety. So you might find that their tolerance for temperature, their tolerance for sound, their tolerance for tags on their clothing, things like that, actually decreases in times of high stress. And in general, I would say, if you see an exacerbation of tics, if you see tics increase, if you see anxiety increase, if you see sensory sensitivities increase, a lot of times those increases are driven by internal factors. They're driven by stress, they're driven by anxiety, especially when it comes to kids. So there were some questions on here as well about kids who have rage attacks. When kids are acting out, they oftentimes are acting out in response to not feeling well. Not physically, like that they're sick, though that can cause it too, but they're oftentimes externalizing anxiety. They are externalizing depression. They're acting out. They don't have the words to say, to explain what they're feeling. They don't have the words to explain what they're thinking. So they show this through their actions. And as a parent, if you can learn to be patient and tolerant, and talk with the child about what's going on inside, a lot of times you're going to uncover that anxiety is running high right now, stress is running high right now, and that will give you an opportunity to focus on those, even though what the child is displaying is externalized or non-compliant behavior. So it's not necessarily the case that they're being non-compliant because they're being bad or they're trying to annoy you. It could very well be that they're being non-compliant, or they're raging, or they're acting out because they're anxious, or they're stressed, or they're scared, or they're overwhelmed right now. When kids reach the breaking point with stress, they tend to externalize that through meltdowns. So that's one way to look at it. Any suggestions to help families add exercise into their routines? Yes. So if you want to do it as a family, that's great. Find something that is fun, find something that is competitive, and understand that exercise does not need to be running a 5K. It can be monitoring steps, see who can take the most steps, or it can be walking around the block several times together. But make it something fun, and make it something feasible, and make it something that you can stick with, and then schedule it, and come up with ways that the family perhaps can compete in a friendly way, to see who can stick with it the longest, or to see who can get the most steps. So adding exercise into your routine needs to be done gradually, and the key is to not give up. When the honeymoon phase is over, the key is to find something else fun. When it comes to reducing stress, it ultimately comes down to moving. It doesn't have to be particularly vigorous exercise. It just needs to be something that's fun and something that's sustainable. And this can be, like I said, it's good if you can get outside. If you can't get outside, this can even be something that's done in the house. But if you're trying to work it into the family, to get the whole family doing it, there's that added kind of social bond that takes place, and the competitiveness that comes when you're doing it as a group. So key is to make it fun. Make sure everybody's on board. I have 2 boys with Tourette, 14-year-old can't listen to my 12-year-old's tics, can't be together. So there were actually a couple of questions about this. What do you do in a situation where everybody's sort of forced inside, and for a variety of reasons, it makes it, Tourette makes it difficult? So whether it be that you have multiple kids with tics, and their tics sort of feed off each other, whether it be something related to the sensory sensitivities, or the emotional status of somebody in the household. I think the key here is that you have to just think about what can you control and what can't you control, and then find ways to accommodate everybody's needs. So, and I realize this is really difficult, because if the kids aren't in school, there's not much you can do about that. It's not like you get the respite of sending them to school. But I think the key is to talk it out, make sure that you are making your expectations clear. Make sure that use this as an opportunity for everyone in the family to have discussions around how COVID is affecting them, how you guys are affecting each other, and really just make that communication front and center. I think that whenever you get in a situation where you don't have full control over the situation, the key is to communicate the best you can. So I apologize that, you know, it's a tough situation, and it probably requires a much more nuanced answer in understanding the particular situation that you're dealing with. But hang in there, make sure you're communicating, and view this as a time to get some work done. View it as a time to increase the bond between family members, a time for family members to learn to be in the same room. You know, there's nothing like being forced into a room full of people to learn how to get along and interact with those people. So view it as an opportunity. Could I possibly touch on disinhibition in school-age children, especially teens? Oh yeah, and let me come back to that. You know, Susie did mention that when you have multiple kids working at home, sometimes you just have to find practical strategies, things like noise canceling headphones, setting up simple barriers, right? So if you have two kids that are working in the same room, simply putting a sheet between them and hanging it from the ceiling, it may look funny, but anything you can do just to create a sense of physical barrier and a bit of privacy, some of those practical solutions can be really helpful. Anita from Facebook, could you possibly touch on disinhibition in school-age children, especially teens? Yeah, we know that kids with Tourette syndrome are at increased risk for broad disinhibition. That's especially the case when they have comorbid ADHD. So disinhibition involves difficulty inhibiting unwanted thoughts, actions, you know, things that they say. So we definitely see this, and you know, there are strategies for reducing disinhibition, but those are therapeutic strategies that usually require a therapist's input. And then just, you know, accommodation. So stop and think programs can be helpful as well. But disinhibition is definitely something that we see fairly common in kids with Tourette. Let's see. Okay, so that, I guess that was the last question that's in here. A lot of great questions, and I wish I had time to provide more detailed answers for some of you, but I do very much hope that you took away a few useful nuggets of information from the talk today. You know, the key, I think, is to understand that stress is normal. It's to be expected, and it can be managed. And so if you take some time this holiday season to just really focus on managing your stress, it is not selfish to take time for yourself. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself. And if you do that, I hope that you will have a happier holiday. And I do hope that you all find the joy and the rest and the relaxation that you deserve. So thank you all for attending tonight. And with that, I will let you all sign off.